Hello and welcome to the Bald Ambition Podcast. I am your host, Mookie Spitz, and I am the bald one. And the one with ambition today is Mr. Fabio Gratton. He is Chief Spiceologist of an amazing new company that has captured and controlled spice. Welcome aboard, Fabio.
Hey, how are you? Nice to be here.
I am well. Thanks for joining us. Ever since I was a little kid, I remember my Hungarian father eating raw paprika at the table. And my 18-year-old son pours Tabasco sauce on everything. And in between, I myself am a spice maniac. I love it on everything. I can't get enough of it. And I've experienced the challenge that I believe your company is addressing in being able to control this stuff, the intensity, the flavor. It's kind of all over the place. So, my own dopamine dependency aside, can you tell us a little bit about what led to the creation of this company and your goal in terms of mastering the spice?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to. Like you, I grew up loving spice. I think since as little as I can remember, from when I was 3 years old, I was trying to get my hands on anything spicy. I think my parents would have to rip things out of my hand before I burned myself. And yeah, I was always there. And as I grew up, I, like a lot of people that like spice, just always sought it out, would go to Indian foods and ask for, the spiciest thing, and obviously hurt myself, and go to Thai restaurants and say, no, give me the real number five. And when I was traveling across Europe, I remember when I was in college, I would find some great pepper at a restaurant and I'd sneak it into a little baggie and take it away like a thief. And I mean, just I had this obsession. I don't think I ever really thought about it as something I would ever turn into a business, but it was always there. And I had and I was kind of also one of those people that probably, like you or your son or many others out there, anything I could get a hold of, whether it was beef jerky or hot sauces, I'd buy it and have these massive collections of stuff like in all my cupboards and every nook and cranny of my kitchen, that something I could add to something with the hope that it would turn up the heat. And so that was always there. But I think that you know I think what really happened was I had enough time to really think a little bit longer. As and maybe some of your listeners don't, is was running a few businesses for quite a few years, and then my father was diagnosed with Alzheimer's a few years ago, and he moved in with us. And at that time, I decided to kind of simplify my life, spend more time at home, and also have two small kids, and just kind of hit the reset button. And it was really during that time that I had a lot more time to think about, like, what's the meaning of life, and what do I want to do, and how do I face this kind of really difficult situation with my father. And it was during that time that I started kind of tinkering. It started with tinkering, kind of, I was cooking meals and preparing things and trying to understand, kind of what I wanted to do. And spice kind of was everywhere around me. And I decided um, to make something for myself. I did not set out to start a company. I stumbled into a product in Italy that had some characteristics that I thought were really interesting. It was these kind of vials of spices numbered from 1 through 17. It was a rather kind of messy, but really inspired me to think about, like, hey, why has no one ever really made spice really easy to understand in a very accessible way for a consumer? That's kind of that was the spark where I said, and again, it wasn't really to start a company. It was, I want this for myself. I got to figure out a way to make this easy.
So it sounds like you're a serial entrepreneur. You've started several companies, and then you had a bit of a hiatus as caregiver for your father. And in that moment of contemplation and meditation, you came to the realization that there's some good things in life that are to be cherished. And you started doing more cooking. You were tincturing with your spices. And then you remember in Italy that there was the beginning of this system of trying to rein in spice, and this captivated you. And it sounds like it was a perfect storm of your entrepreneurship, your compassion, your culinary interests, and interest in everything spicy, and this opportunity to start something and see where it would go.
Exactly. I think that's a great, really well said. And yeah, and probably to add maybe like one other like layer to it is, um, my wife, runs an Etsy store. She's a stay-at-home mom, but she'll go insane if that's all she did. And she, ran a really interesting Etsy store where she bought these like machinery that from China that is able to like cut wood and cut acrylic. And so we had this like giant machine sitting in our garage, and she'd always do these really interesting things, like really artistic and really creative. And so I think when I was sitting there kind of thinking about like how do I bring spices together and how do I do this, I also had sort of access coincidentally to this machine. And I was like, well, like I don't know how to use it. I don't really know. I know Photoshop, I don't know Illustrator, I don't know how to design things that get cut up in the physical world. I've only done things digitally in my life. And so I think there was a kind of an interesting challenge too of like, I bought a bunch of glue, a bunch of tape, a bunch of material, and my kids were just having a blast just watching me and then sitting with me and eventually participating with me, basically doing like a very complicated craft project together that lasted a long, long time. So that was kind of, I think, also spurred me to just want to keep doing it, even if I didn't really know where it was going, because we were all having a blast just kind of sitting down and cutting things up and watching the machine do things and then seeing whether all the parts fit together. So I think that kind of like allowed me to sit in the moment for longer than maybe most people normally would, because it became sort of a really great project with the family.
And now you're referring to what would eventually become the grinders of the spice. Is that right?
Well, interestingly enough, the first problem I was trying to solve was actually the box. In other words, so like let me break down real quickly sort of the components of spice. So I had seen basically this system, and it was these giant, like imagine like giant, weighty test tubes with like cork stoppers and like little wooden spoons and like 17 of these, like very unwieldy, very heavy, really hard to kind of balance. And so at first it was just more like, okay, I like the idea of a numbered system, and what if we could simplify this into a numbering system that people understand? For example, why 17? Why not 10? Right? There's just too much to consume, and everybody understands 1 through 10. So then it was, okay, well, I'm probably going to put these inside. I mean, so this is where the funny part is about the story is I'm like, well, I'll put them in better tubes. Like I'm like, of course I'm going to put these in some kind of container, but I wasn't really thinking about where I ended up of grinders or shakers, or I just started with there'll probably be some kind of tube, and at some point I have to decide what kind of tube it is. But what's important is how do they all hold together? Like, are they like in a row? Are they laying on their back? Or is it like a little like cigar box that kind of swings open? Like, I was really obsessed with I guess the package that would hold the spice before I was concerned about. I didn't know where I would source the spice. I didn't know that there was going to be grinders. I was just like, how do I want to experience this? Like, you walk up to a dinner table, or you're at a restaurant, or you're at your home. How does this thing get brought out and get revealed to you? So I was all over the place. I was in mechanical things, electric things. I had things that like had light and music. I mean, it was like, some pretty crazy stuff, and it was all about the presentation to the person at the table. So that's kind of where it started, and then and then naturally at some point as I started to get a shape, I'm like, well, like what kind of tubes? And my process has been, and probably a lot of people's process is I just would go deep, deep, deep down a rabbit hole, like on one vector. So once, I mean, I had like dozens and dozens and dozens of different types of materials and boxes and shapes and stuff. And I started kind of narrowing in on that. I was like, all right, well, now I need to figure out the container. I ordered every grinder imaginable. I bought everything I could. I probably had about 50 or 60 different types of grinders, shakers, holders, tubes. And every night, along with like working on the packaging box stuff, I would take the least spicy spice, sometimes just like a paprika or something like that. And I would just put it inside all these containers and just look at it and just go, okay, is this enough material? Does this and what I started finding with all of this stuff is that it really sucked. Um, that there was no real that especially if you put it in a tube without a mechanism to like there was really only two options, right? There's like either it's a tube that you have to somehow scoop out with a spoon or a shaker, the kinds that you find say at pizzerias or like on most generic spices that you find at the grocery store. And the problem is the moment you move into the hotter stuff, like and I'll call it my like 4, 5, 6, 7s, like the higher numbers, higher Scoville heat units, stuff that like really can burn. You you start shaking that stuff out, and you create like a nuclear cloud of that's going to have people crying, coughing, and running for the doors. And so I realized that I had the big problem was, wait, I can't just create a system 1 through 10 in a nice box. There has to be a way that it gets contained and then delivered and controlled. And so that led me down what you were talking about, the grinder path. So I'm going to pause there for a second and see if that makes sense.
Yeah, it sure does. So if I'm hearing you right, you focused on the experience at the dinner table. So if someone is spice questing, then how would they go about administering the spice in a way that was holistic, fun, and also efficient? So you mentioned you thought of everything from bright lights to whatever. You knew you needed some tubes to contain the stuff. You remember the numbering system, Y17, and we've got 10 fingers. We're in a decimal system, 1 to 10 from low spice to high. That's what you started with. And I think listeners should also know that you're a communications specialist. You're all about messaging and experience throughout your career, and the companies that you've started are in that agency world of marketing and experiential communication. So it's only natural that you would begin that way. And to me, what's fascinating is that the obstacles, the problems that you needed to solve evolved once you got into the mechanics and the engineering of actually delivering that spice in a way, to your point, that wouldn't ghost pepper bomb the entire room on the one hand, and on the other be something that would be aesthetically appealing and serviceable and ultimately marketable.
Absolutely. And the number of problems becomes compounds itself, right? Because you start with the presentation layer because I had the opportunity to is sitting at home, and we have friends and family that would come over, and my dad always had visitors, and I would always bring out my stuff on the table. So I was in a constant focus group, if you will. Now again, not because I was trying to create a company, but because you're building something and you're kind of excited to share it with people, and a lot of people I know, they do like some level of spice. So I was always bringing things out, and so for a long time, it was just people like little spoons and like little jars and little things, but like nice containers. And I watched people, and they loved, the game, right? They would go like, "Oh my God, give me the one. Oh, like that's easy. Like give me the two." And they worked their way up, kind of like hot ones, and it became this and it was like young and the old, and it was very dynamic. But as I kind of evolved to these new problems, I realized that they kind of were part and parcel. So separating it the way I did was useful. However, you kind of had to then revisit, like, for example, when I started narrowing down to types of grinders that I wanted to use, I realized that, well, that was going to change the nature of the box. Because, if you have a grinder that maybe has potential leakage in it because you want it to be something that can be dispersed mechanically, now all of a sudden your box no longer works the way you wanted it to work if it had been a tube, or some other container. So then you had to kind of go backwards and fix those problems in order to go back forward. But the grinder problem was kind of a big problem too, because we haven't talked about it, but eventually this is a big a big lesson I had learned, and this, having started my Bright Life, which is, in the club soda space, is probably one of the first lessons or hardest lessons to have learned in building a physical brand, a consumer brand, is how important the cost of goods are in kind of making sure that you're building a viable business, not just because you built something great, but because the economics make sense. And for some reason, no matter how smart you think you are, you make really, really dumb mistakes, in your career. And I mean, some of the dumb mistakes are you skip past these really seemingly logical things like, well, how much will somebody be willing to pay for water, right? And when you start adding up the cost of glass, the cost of shipping, the cost of production and everything, and you end up with like a bottle of water that in order to break even might cost somebody, $5 or $7, most people won't buy that. And, I mean, there's the rare exceptions, of course, but most people won't. So you then end up in this like, holy shit, what have I done? And so I was really, really, really conscious. And again, I wasn't trying to build a business, but if I still was obsessed with like, yeah, you could buy something really nice or really nice material, really expensive grinders or all this stuff, but like, if if the creating 10 of something, remember, like my goal was 10, anything I multiplied by 10, it couldn't be $300, right? So I had this big issue of like, how do I make this thing awesome, but not make it impossible for it to ever like, what if I want to give it to my brother for Christmas, or to family members? Forget about a business. Like, it would be cost prohibitive. So I really was trying to figure out, like, the 10 became an obsession with me, because I knew that if I couldn't solve the 10 problem, like something great, but that couldn't be super expensive, but it had to be unique and high quality, then none of this would ever work. So that's kind of like was a big hurdle, and that's kind of like led to the whole, like, how the hell do you solve this grinder problem?
So it sounds like up to this point, you were having a blast falling down the steps, as it were. And at this point, you had to land on your feet. So you knew at that time that to make a viable product, even to share with your family, as you mentioned, you had 10 units of something that already displayed the engineering and mechanical complexity that drove up costs to make it just not a feasible, viable kind of product that people could buy and use. So that was challenge number one. And then I'm assuming that the next steps had to be finding this balance between economic efficiency, if it were, and aesthetics and ease of use and effectiveness. So
Absolutely.
how did you do that?
Well, I mean, a lot of mistakes and a lot of like dead ends, but I think the first thing was, you still have to go back to sort of the unit, right? The single unit before you go back to the 10. And what is that experience that I want to create? Now, similar to the boxes I was talking about earlier, um, I I started with like buying every single possible type of grinder imaginable. And I, had probably, again, maybe 40 or 50 of everything possible. I knew I wanted some type of grinding mechanism. And the reason is because I I had learned along the way that if I went to a powder right out of the bat, the powder was really difficult to manage on the food if I started with a powder. So basically, let me take a step back in chili peppers. My my core business at the end of the day was really focused on delivering a variety of varietals of chili peppers. I discovered, little to my own, knowledge at the beginning, was I thought that maybe there were like 20 or 30, and I was like, hey, I'm going to pick the best 10. Turns out there's about 4,000 different varietals of chili pepper, of which maybe the average consumer knows about, half a dozen. And so this whole journey along the way of trying to figure out, like, well, what do I put inside these things, was it's its own. We'll get back to that later, but because of that, so you learn, you're like, okay, you've got pepper that comes in like the fresh pepper. Then the fresh pepper can become, a dehydrated pod. So it's the very same thing, but without water, basically losing, 90% of a pepper is water. And then you go from a pod, and the pod has got, the stem and the seeds. And most people don't even know that the seeds are not even the spicy part of a pepper. They think that the seeds are the spicy part. And that's why it makes kind of no sense when you see at a pizzeria, it's like all seeds. You're like, no wonder it tastes terrible. But anyway, so you've got this pod, and then you can crush the pod, and that can get crushed into sort of a flake, and then it can also get crushed into a powder. And then, of course, people take it from there, and they could turn it into like all sorts of rubs and mixes and hot sauces. But my goal was really to deliver that on your plate, you would have sort of the a powder like thing, but if I went right to a powder, the grinder wouldn't work. There's nothing to grind. It's like you don't really want to put already ground salt in a salt grinder because it doesn't do anything. It just pushes it out. And so you need to have it in this kind of form that's more of flake like. And the
Why
reason,
why why the easy way out in a sense? So, or why not the easy way out? So you're having this grinder crisis, and what prevented you from just having dispensers of powder? Why not go that route?
well, a lot of kind of a lot of reasons. First of all, like, because at that point, you just had a shaker, and you'd end up back at the same problem, which is you'd somehow be throwing up a toxic cloud of pepper. And so if you have any kind of shaker, there's nothing, a grinder itself. So basically, I guess this goes back to something I'm just taking for granted, which is, I mean, you either press the stuff down out of a grinder, or you shake it out from the top, right? It's either top or bottom. Like, that's kind of the way it is. And anything from the top is typically a shaker, and anything from the bottom is typically some kind of grinder. And if you grind, then you have a grind mechanism, and you can't start with a powder, because then it's basically, it just leaks all over the place, and it just pushes. And the second problem with that, I mean, yes, you could do that, but it's very, very messy. But the second part is that I learned pretty early on, which is, it's just like pepper. Why do people like ground pepper or salt, like, Himalayan salts and these like little salt rocks? Why do people really like that? Well, they like it not just because of the sound and because it's cool, but they like it because it actually is fresher. It tastes better. It has this, the moment you crack a pepper, be it chili pepper or black pepper, you actually get the freshness gets released on the spot. If it's already a powder, then that freshness is already gone, and over time it wears away much, much faster. It gets more oxygenated. You don't contain that freshness, so you really want to be doing the crushing at the moment on your food. And that's again, learn the hard way, because early on, even if I was dehydrating peppers, I was over I was over grinding everything. And then there's a whole host of other problems that emerge from that, which are things like clumping and humidity. And I mean, you just get like, because my grinders, like a lot of grinders have sort of mechanical components. You just don't want all that powder kind of getting jammed in all the parts, or loose in all your box and spreading across everything, especially when you're dealing with, very, very hot things in the same box as something that's supposed to be very mild. If you have powder, you're going to end up with this cross contamination, and you're going to have some, you're going to have a lot of tears. Let me put it that way.
Totally makes sense. And the experiential component, going back to your original line of thinking and feeling about this, is awesome. You work for it. You crank it out, and you're guaranteed that freshness and immediacy by putting in
Yeah.
some thumb grease.
Yep. Yep. Exactly. And again, I'd love to say that this was all like, you know, this really well thought out. I knew exactly what I was, but not at all. Like not the least bit. I mean, all of this was, I mean, so from the moment I decided to start playing with or tinkering with like, oh, how do I create a container to hold this stuff, to the moment I actually launched was 18 months. So it was 18 months of like figuring and of course now it's been another 8 months since launching, and I've still learned an incredible amount since, because you just don't know what you don't know, obviously, until you're doing it. And then when you're doing it, you have so many of these both aha moments and also oh fuck moments, right? Because there's just a lot of stuff you're just like, how did I not think about that, or I didn't know that. I mean, I've made so many mistakes along the way, and like I said, you think you're smart, but you realize just how dumb you are when you actually start to like go down the path of trying to create something like this. And again, I thought I knew spice, but man, like I look back now and I think to myself like just how naive I was about what I thought I knew or understood about spice. And I don't know, that's it's kind of good and bad. Like there's a part of me that says like it's wonderful, like after spending my most of my life in the career I've been on before, um it's just amazing when you feel like you're starting all over and you're learning so much, because it just is incredible stimulation. I think as you and I have spoken about before, about just like when you're starting something new and you're learning so much, you're just like you're invigorated and energized, but you're also feel a little like inept. You feel like a little like unqualified. You feel like you're in the deep end of a pool, and so you have to balance the fear and the sense of constant like failure and ineptitude with the, well, I'm putting myself in this position, and I can only learn, and this is the only way to learn. There's no other way to learn. You can't skip the learning phase. And so that the grinder part, and I know we haven't really kind of double clicked down that, but um, it started with like once I figured out the type of grinder I wanted, a whole new host of problems emerged, which is there was no way. Like I couldn't find exactly the grinder I wanted. I knew the general idea. I wanted it to be push button. I wanted it to be mechanical. I wanted it to be in your hand. But in mass production, and like all there were these very large grinders, and if I put 10 of those together, the thing would have weighed you know 10 pounds, and it would have been a giant box, like a lunch pail, and it just wouldn't have been practical at all. And any of the smaller grinders were really really cheap material, and there was maybe one or two in the world that were higher quality, and they were $25 a unit, um, making it again impossible. I then ran into this new problem, which is there's nothing I can just source off the shelf to actually solve my problem. Now that I know what I want, what do I do?
Well, it sounds like a hero's journey in a sense, right? You're the hero of spice. You're the knight in shining pepper armor, and that drama that you describe, how you're really starting out with a distended goal. You have a general idea of where you're headed and what you want, and then all of a sudden you're encountering all sorts of obstacles you never even anticipated, and then you're making mistakes that, in retrospect, seem foolish and obvious. And it's that energy, it's that drama that goes into the product, I think, in ways that people can feel that this never really existed before. You're cutting a new swath of something, a new experiential culinary engagement, and it's exciting. And the excitement is palpable in your voice and retelling of the tale. So we're dealing with hot stuff here, all the way from inception to the final product. And I think that's what it's all about: entrepreneurship, trying new things, and also the thrill of getting your dopamine stimulated when you're grinding out that ghost pepper onto your favorite burger. I think that
Right.
this is a wonderful kind of continuity, and it's fascinating that you've applied the entrepreneurial skills that were demonstrated before in an entirely new situation that had, as you mentioned, a physicality to it. You're dealing with mechanics and engineering and learning along the way about this thing that you thought you knew about, namely hot stuff and peppers. And as you look under the hood and you keep grinding, as it were, you're discovering more and more of what you didn't know. And along the way, something cool and super spicy is coming out.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because and I think you did that's a great summary. You go to a farmer's market and you walk and people have you see all sorts of wares out there, and the person who's like selling the little bottle of spice, or the person who's selling honey in a little tube, or the person who's made little belts out of leather, and the artistry that goes into all those things is pretty amazing. And I think we take it for granted that somebody had to have like not only the idea but then the material and then the packaging and all of that, and some of it's really good and some of it's not that great, some of it's very kind of homey and an amateur, but to some degree like that idea of just having this thing that you want to bring to the public or the consumer. And I had that was kind of like my simple idea was like when people would ask me, so what are you planning to do with this? I'm like, farmers markets. It's like, I like genuinely, I just think it'd be fun if I can show up to farmers markets and have like this little spice kit, this little spice box. And wouldn't that be cool? And so it was like very like just much more about like being very artisanal and very so I think maybe because I thought that way for quite a while through this project, it also made me less intimidated because I didn't really have bald ambitions. I didn't really have like these great ambitions to like try to mass produce or produce in large quantities and ship all across the country and launch an e-commerce brand. Like I didn't really think about all that. I thought about, man, if I could just make it to a farmer's market with this thing in my hand and watch somebody's face say like, "Oh, that's so cool. I'm so glad you made that because I wanted something like that too." That was really my target. And like I think that was honestly up until I would say pretty much up until 3 months before I launched, because I launched at a kind of like a local farmer's market type thing. Like it was like the chili cook-off in Tustin. And my goal was just really to have that experience of like, here's like a good that might be good for somebody else. And I think, but to your point about the entrepreneurial thing, I think it took a lot of the pressure off of I wasn't even thinking about the broader like marketing and scale and all of these other things which would come in later. But you're confronted with those because the moment you start trying to manufacture something like say a grinder, you quickly realize. I mean, so this becomes where the tail wags the dog, because in order to produce something that isn't ridiculously expensive requires you to produce a certain amount of scale. And so that forces you down the path of like, well, how many farmers markets are there? It's like, I can't, if I have to produce a minimum of 10,000 grinders for this to even be sort of affordable, that's a shit ton of farmers markets I have to get to. And so you start thinking, it forces you to go like, well, who else would buy this? And holy crap, I need to make, you know, 20,000 boxes for being able, of these kits for the kits. And you start, all the different components start to like have to be in somewhat bigger scale in order for it to even make sense for your little worldview, like my little farmers market idea, that suddenly you're kind of forced to have to think a little bit bigger. And it was a lot of this kind of when you move the goalpost on yourself, right, without even realizing it, it was a lot of this little movements of the goalpost that started to happen that I didn't even really perceive or really realize were happening, but they kind of keep happening because you're like, well, I mean, that's what I got to do. I got to, I'm not going to gotta find the right cost, structure for this thing to be a little bit bigger. And so anyway, so I think it's funny you say that, because yes, you have this part of your mind that like building a business, but I was probably trying to do everything I could to suppress it along the way.
Yeah, small problems lead to big problems.
Right.
And then to try to get out of those bigger problems, then you've got even bigger ones.
Right.
And then
Right.
in retrospect, solving the really big problems, like how am I going to be able to unload 10, 20,000 of these units just to make it affordable and scalable in that way? And then all of a sudden, surprise, surprise, you've got a company.
Exactly. Exactly. Like, yeah, you don't like, I was very counter to everything I've done before, which it's very deliberate. Like, I didn't even know, to be honest, like, I mean, I could go in so many different directions on this, but like, I didn't really realize the market itself. Like, I just figured, hey, it's people like me, or I figured it's like moms that buy, like stuff for the kitchen. I mean, I was wrong, 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 wrong about that. I mean, I didn't realize, what like the white space looked like. I know you've mentioned that before about like, hey, like why has nobody done this? Like, it wasn't really until I launched that people started saying to me like, I can't believe nobody's done this. I can't. And then of course, along the way, I started thinking about, the analogy I use is like coffee or tea or cannabis or wine, in the sense of, there was a day and age where weed was just a bag of grass, and tea was just a bag of dried leaves, and coffee was just it was Folgers at the truck stops, or whatever. It's like, there was a day when none of those things were considered special. Nobody had a frappum latte, cappuccino, caramel macchiato, whatever. Like, that stuff didn't exist. And there was a day when these things were just pure commodities. And somehow we became more sophisticated, and people became more sophisticated, and people decided to build brands and companies, but also elevate the experience, elevate the knowledge and understanding, elevate the sophistication, and it worked. And I think along the way, as I watched people reacting to the thing that I had created, which again was not meant to be something like transformative, I was like, I need this. Hopefully some other people need it. But I started watching people going like, you've just completely changed my life. Like, this, why has nobody done this? Like, me and my family now, we don't eat the same way. We can't even go to restaurants now and think the same way. We like and my nephew was in town, who's like 80 years old. And like, he was at a restaurant apparently, and he's like, do you have the number 8? They're from England. And like, the waiter was like, what? Because he's like, assumes that the world is operating within my operating system, and that's really cool, right? Because that's my goal, is to create sort of a system that everybody knows and understands, that like we can all be on the same page. But it just, again, it didn't start, it wasn't like, all of that was completely accidental.
Yeah, when people don't know what they're missing, then they don't know what they're missing. And
Right.
it's the Henry Ford thing where if you ask people what they want, they'll just say, oh, well,
More hot sauce.
a faster horse. Yeah, send me another bottle of Tabasco. So by creating a solution to, in a sense, a problem that they were not conscious of, there's an amazing feedback loop here where you're growing your audience based on your audience's experience of the solution that you're providing.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And I, again, I'll give you another perfect example is, I assumed incorrectly that spice was spice when you broke it down. Like, I understand hot sauces is like, a million different things you could put in it, but spice being like the core thing. Yes, there's a lot of varietals, but I mean, but okay, beyond that, like, a ghost pepper's a ghost pepper, and a Carolina Reaper's a Carolina Reaper, and but not, what you also learn is that culturally, that, you've got like the Indian culture, you got the Asian, you've got the Chinese culture, you've got the European culture, you got the American culture. The concept of spice is very, very different. Like it's not what I thought it was, that like this world is kind of uniform. And again, why should I have thought that? But I don't know. It was just, yeah, I didn't think about it at all. It wasn't that I made a bad assumption, is I didn't even think about it. But I started to see that what a Korean tasting something that you may think is really hot, that even if its Scoville heat unit is really hot, if they don't recognize the flavor, they don't consider it the same heat as the food that they eat. Or the same thing with an Indian, same thing with a Nigerian, that culturally, spice, and I don't know how to, like, I've actually tried to talk to some scientists about this, but I think it's like there's a receptor in the mouth that might be different across different cultures, that literally sensitizes or desensitizes them to certain, like, in other words, if you don't recognize it as a spice, you don't even think of it as spicy, which is really bizarre. And so I've then had to kind of start expanding my mind and thinking, well, if I want to serve the world, which I do. I mean, at least culturally, I want to serve the world. I'm not necessarily saying ship everywhere, but I'm saying, America is a melting pot of many, many different cultures, that I have to start thinking about, well, what does this different type of, like a Mexican, Hispanic and Mexicans, they like heat, but they like it in a certain way with certain flavors. Like they like more the sort of chipotle flavor, and you've got the Japanese kind of flavors, which are kind of blends of different spices. And they actually have slightly different flavors, slightly different way that they were grown. And so you have this expectation that I, out of the gate, didn't meet, which was really interesting. So people would be like, "Oh, that's good, but you should really try my spice." And I'm like, "Okay, where do I get it?" And then I'd get it, and I'd be like, "That's not that hot." Like, and they're like, "Oh my god, that is way hotter." And I'm like, "Okay, then there's something else going on here which I need to learn about." And that led me down the whole path too, by the way, because I think you know that I was obsessed with measuring the heat, the capsaicin levels. I'm actually working on an instrument right now with a lab to build my own sort of capsaicin measurement tool, because like I want the stuff to be very consistent, there to be like sort of a quality to it that people can have an expectation, but that kind of like only takes you so far. The flavor profile,
Let's put a pin on it for
yeah.
just a second because you've covered some fascinating ground and
Okay, yeah.
much of it is foundational. So and correct me if I'm misrepresenting, but there's two aspects that I hear you getting at. And the first aspect of spice that almost everyone is familiar with intuitively is the level of what we would call heat intensity, how air quote spicy it is,
Yeah.
from mild to medium to hot. Now, spice, the essential molecule of spice is known as capsaicin, which
Yep.
is what you referred to. It is categorized as an irritant, so that
Hmm.
when it interacts with any of your glands, your tongue, your mouth, your throat, it irritates the membranes in a way which folks like us who love spice consider it very, very pleasurable in kind of this agonist, enticing kind of way, right?
Yeah.
It's titillating in ways. It's an acquired taste. Like so many great things in life are acquired taste. When a child first interacts with anything capsaicin, it's an irritant. They make a face, they cry, but with repeat exposures, it becomes quite pleasurable indeed. So the active element of spice is capsaicin, and it is measured in terms of Scoville units. And if I got this right, a Scoville unit is a volume metric, so that if a spice, let's say, has a Scoville measurement of 10,000, that means that you need to dilute that hot sauce by 10,000 fold for the spice to vanish. So if I had a 1 milliliter volume of, let's say, a hot sauce, if I multiply that by 10,000 units, then the spice is completely gone. So if you have a habanero pepper of 1 million Scoville units and you put that in some kind of liquid form, then you need to dilute it by 1 million times for the heat intensity to vanish. Do I have that right? Just so we have a framework of the active element of spice is capsaicin, which is an irritant molecule, and spice is measured in Scoville units, which is a factor of dilution, which basically suggests that the higher the Scoville number, the hotter the hot sauce or pepper is. Did I get that right?
That's exactly right. And it's very confusing to people because it's actually derived from a non-scientific measurement. You described it right. It's, you're diluting something by 1,000 times in, say, in water, in sugared water, and at the point at which there's like five taste, this is the way it kind of began. It's like five taste testers are sitting there, and they all have to agree after they keep diluting and diluting that at a certain point they no longer taste heat. It's a very subjective, like the classic Scoville heat unit is a very subjective
And that's
measurement.
why it varies. You know,
Exactly.
you hear like a bottle of Tabasco sauce is 20,000 Scoville units, and then you read it, and no, it's actually 52,000. So it becomes all over the place. So just to be clear, the first variable that we're discussing vis-a-vis spice is Scoville unit intensity measured on this scale, which is induced by the capsaicin molecule. That's number one. And number two, what you're getting at, that's not the whole spice story. And this is what I find most fascinating in your product and really the undiscovered country that you're introducing to spice tourists, including myself, who've been spicing up my whole life. And that's the element of flavor. And and correct me if I'm wrong, there's really no catalog that's really definitive in terms of describing the different types of flavor. You mentioned chipotle, which the Mexican or Latin community is really fond of.
Yeah.
Then you have other red pepper flavors that the Asian community
Right.
is fond of. So there are two elements here that SpiceQuest, your company, is enabling consumers to control and administer really like never before. You have these grinders from 1 to 10, which are an indication of the Scoville capsaicin created
Right.
intensity of that pepper.
Right.
And then you have other factors which you infuse these grinder experiences with, which are the flavor. So you can have a 7, which is less intense than a 9, but the difference between the 7 and 9 goes beyond just the
Oh yeah.
intensity because you're able to control the flavor too.
Exactly.
And I think that's a huge differentiator. You know, the theme of this podcast series is differentiation, brand identity, messaging. How do we make a lasting impression in the mindscape of the consumer, which is memorable, which solves a problem, and which provides a benefit? And the benefit that you're providing, if I got this right, based on what you were just describing, is unprecedented control of heat intensity and flavor. And you get to choose both
Yes.
at your dinner table.
Exactly. No, that's really well said. I would just add to that, which is I think, and again, we throw around, you know, flavor, in a lot of different ways. I would say that, I was one of the probably smartest things I did do early on before I launched, months before, is I tracked down probably the leading spiceologist in the world who's probably published more papers on plants and the fruit and capsaicin and has done more breeding. He's actually technically kind of discovered and you can't say created, but discovered the ghost pepper. I didn't know it at the time. I called him up because he was clearly the person that was coming up in all the different research on capsaicin and chili peppers. And the reason I called him up was because I was running into a big problem. I was actually trying to solve a heat problem. So you're going to appreciate this because I'm going to address sort of both parts of this problem. The story is I was already starting to do. I found that like even though Scoville heat unit, is a very subjective test. Obviously, as they've developed instruments like HPLC, which you could send stuff to labs, and it's expensive, a little time consuming. The equipment itself is very expensive, but I started to kind of build a little lab here. To be able to do it myself, as well as sending material off to the lab. And what I found was that the spice, the capsaicin and the equivalent Scoville heat unit was all over the place, right? So that was like problem. I was trying to solve this problem at first, because if you're going to create a 1 through 10, your 1 and your 2 and your 3 better be in that order, right? So that was like a problem I wanted to solve. But I found, just picking out, like, because I was trying to figure out my 10, which I knew was going to probably be the Carolina Reaper, because the Carolina Reaper had been the world record holder. And even though Reaper, um, the X Pepper X has since come out, but that's not available in a powder pepper form, so you can't even get it. That's a whole different kind of quagmire there. But essentially, I was like, okay, well, all I have to do is find a hot Carolina Reaper, because every single bottle, every single packaging says that's 1.5 million to 2.2 million Scoville heat units. Well, no matter what I got from where I got it, I was just finding that all my lab tests came out. I couldn't find a single Carolina Reaper that was over 1.2, 1.3 million. Not a single one. And I'm talking like, I bought like from 30 different companies. And I was shocked. I was like, and it's the subject of a blog I've since written. And obviously there's a lot more to unpack there, but like that's for a whole different podcast. But
Yeah, we can leave links. We'll
yeah.
leave links in the
Oh,
description,
like
folks. With Fabio, will send you some info.
I could, you and I, having worked in the healthcare space, you can't make claims without backing them up with evidence, and clearly, that's not the case in chili peppers. You can make whatever claim you want, and nobody is going to fact check you, and nobody's going to fine you, and nobody's going to care.
But
And
this begs the question of the utility of SpiceQuest,
right,
which is you are formalizing and standardizing levels of heat
exactly,
administration, right?
exactly.
So this is brand new too. This is huge.
Yeah, and nobody.
When does a company measure and confirm the Scoville unit intensity of a pepper, and then to where you're headed, conjoin that
With the
with
flavor, yeah.
with a clinically purified flavor, if you will.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But that was what prompted me to call this expert, because I wanted to know, am I crazy? Right? I'm like, what am I doing wrong? Is this the best type of lab test? And I remember I described to him the whole problem. Dr. Paul Bosland, he created the Chili Pepper Institute in New Mexico. And I described this problem to him, and he laughed for a while. And I was like, this is the godfather of chili peppers, if you will. And he laughed for a while, and he goes, oh yeah, like that's exactly what's going to happen. And I go, what do you mean? And he's like, that's what's going to happen. He's like, yeah, you're probably never going to find a pepper that's over 2 million or even 1.5 million, and they're never going to be the same. And of course, there's like all the classic agricultural part of it, which is like different earth, different environment, different, watering, like climate, like there's all that stuff that impacts how the plant grows. But there's also the fact that just because a pepper one got the world record and 5 people were there to measure it and validate it, doesn't mean that there's any other pepper in that varietal that will ever match that again, right? But now you could put that on every piece of packaging. And so he said, yeah, it's a big for those who care, it's kind of a problem, because we say, like, why are we calling peppers like of these kind of heat ranges when that's not really true? He goes, but most of the world doesn't seem to care, but the way you're doing your stuff, like, obviously that matters a lot. And so he goes, but you know what? And I go, what? He goes, you know, what's really important too is the flavor profile. And I go, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, and then this is so and if you've seen some of my material, like my obsession is, he's like, it's just like wine. He's like, how when you describe wine, it has a certain flavor. Is it earthy? Is it like fruity? He goes, but it also, is it more in the nose? How does it affect the back of your throat? Is it something that has like tannins? Is it smooth? Like, where do you taste? Like, he described all this. And he goes, I've published a paper where we've started to create sort of a format for like this idea of describing chili pepper. Is it, how fast does it come on? Right? The intensity of it coming on, and how long does it linger? Does it hit the front of your mouth or the back of your throat? Is it flat or is it sharp? And then the flavor, is it, is it earthy? Is it sweet? Is it fruity? And he described all this to me and obviously pointed me to the paper, and I just consumed this paper and I was like, oh my God. He's like, you should do that for all your peppers. And as you know, I do now. And people love that. Because not only that, not only can you describe all these characteristics, there's still some subjectivity, but more or less people will say that my tasting notes are like pretty spot on. And the reason they are spot on is not only do I use third party research, but I also actually do a bunch of taste testings with people, and I have them like fill out cards and describe to me like where does it hit you? And once there's consensus, it's pretty clear. And so nobody's ever done that on on a consumer product. I mean, besides, what Dr. Paul Boslin's doing. And so that was really, really cool. And then where you take it to the next level, which is kind of where I'm trying to go now, is there's like, how does that then pair with food? Because once you understand the heat profile and the sort of flavor and taste profile, then, oh, does that go well on an avocado, on a salad, on a fish, on a meat, on a pasta, on a pizza? Like, what? So when you start combining these things, and that becomes really, really, really interesting. And people love that because, if you're not, think about wine, right? If you're not sophisticated, and I know, Spitz, you and I have shared a glass of wine before where you've put ice in it, and I laugh. But there's a lot of people that are kind of like that. Their idea of chili peppers is like the peppers that you see in the pizzeria. The giant little plastic bottle, and that people just shake out. The pepper flakes mostly made of seeds. And if that's your experience, like you're not going to be like, oh, like does that go well on a fish? Is that, like, that's it. It's like you got one hammer and to everything is a nail. And so to me, that's like the real opportunity here, is also educating people about how to incorporate it with various meals. And people really appreciate it. And then they start sharing. And of course, this is where you really need the culinary community, the chefs, the home chefs, professional chefs, amateur chefs that really love to do the mixology there, um, to start sharing their recipes with you. And like that's a whole, like, let's call that 2025. That's something I'm working on right now, trying to find more, chefs that want to work with me to actually sort of kind of make recommendations for recipes and so forth. And because that is the pairing is really, really interesting.
Yeah, the analog with wine is pitch perfect because pairing is contingent on your ability to control
Yes.
what you're pairing. And
Yeah.
up to this point, and I think that this is very significant, there was no way to meaningfully pair because the variables of both spice intensity and flavor were uncontrollable, variable, and to a large extent random. So now that you're empowering people with a number and with a flavor, they're able for the first time to do pairings with particular foods and experiment. You don't know until you know. And then I'm sure there's surprises that we never would have thought that this particular flavor would go well on a mango, let's say, and certain types of cuisine. And
Exactly.
this is amazing. It's empowering chefs in ways and with tools that they never had before. And to me, I find this fascinating. Just as you're a fan of spice, I'm a fan of spice, but you started this journey not knowing that much about spice.
No.
Why didn't you know that much? Because the tools of controlling intensity and flavor never existed. So you're like everybody else, which is, well, give me some of this and give me some of that, and we'll hope for the best and let's see what happens.
Pretty much.
And as you learned, you were empowered with this ability that you could control it. And that led you to the opportunity to share that opportunity, but it also opened your eyes as to the potential, the kind of undiscovered country that is spice. And that paves the way for others to do the same.
Yep. Yep. And that's, you know, I think that's a great way to put it, and I think that that's why the sky is now the limit. I think what probably if there's like one takeaway from the first, I guess from the last 2 years, but from especially since launching, and because everything I've described to you has been primarily what I've learned to get to launch, right? Then when you're really in market, you start to see how people actually react and what they do, and just this diversity of audiences that is like second to none. I mean, we didn't get into the ridiculous health benefits of capsaicin, and there's a whole community of people that can't take salt, and have to reduce certain, they have really bland foods because of cholesterol, and like, oh my god, it's a huge audience, and capsaicin has some incredible, you know uh, benefits to cholesterol, to metabolic effects, to I mean, I got a letter the other day, dude. Spitz, it'll make you cry, but like it was a letter from a mom that basically said, my number 11 saved her son's life. She said he was suicidal. He was like, and that they were like out at wits end, couldn't figure out how to knock him out of his depression, and they had the crazy idea. They had gotten him a spice kit, I don't know, for Christmas or something, and the crazy idea of like giving him the number 11 because of the sort of endorphin effect, right? Because it's kind of like a natural stimulant. And apparently, she wrote this. I didn't solicit this. Apparently, after they gave him the hit of the number 11, like within the same day, he decided to go into therapy. He went into like he got a psychiatrist, went into therapy, like got over his depression, like started taking action. And his like she's like literally from a caring mom. Thank you for saving my son's life. I
Oh,
mean,
I believe it. I
that's
believe it.
crazy, right?
As an ADHD warrior, I have dopamine deficiency, and my obsession with spice, I think, has a lot to do with these psychological, neurological effects that you're describing this mom sharing with you. Heavy duty cardio has to be a part of my life each and every day, and I'm a maniac on the Peloton. I'm a jogger. I'm a health enthusiast because it feels so good cognitively. It has a calming effect. And spice for me, ever since I was a kid, had that same kind of calming effect. And you mentioned the other benefits of capsaicin in terms of immunological
Yeah,
equilibrium, metabolic
it's crazy.
control.
Yeah,
It's really amazing. And the origin of spice, I mean, if you look at Sichuan province in China, Sichuan food is known
yeah,
for its heavy peppered spice. It's basically a circular valley that was probably an asteroid impact. It's a big asteroid crater. But the people of Sichuan started to use spice as a preservative. Obviously, they didn't have refrigerators, and the little valley was kind of isolated. And spice was used in terms of its preservative qualities. But that begs the question of its ability to fight parasites, contagions, and disease. And I think the trajectory since people were first discovering the origins of spice, and I'm sure at this point you know a whole lot more about the history of spice than I do, but since the earliest times there was an intuitive understanding that high capsaicin foods had amazing benefit, not only in terms of
yeah.
preservation, but in fighting disease
I know.
and in benefiting health.
And
So
most
so
people
that
don't. And most people don't. And again, in all candor, I was not part of my like. I did not start like. I mean, I liked spice. I knew it made me feel good, and I knew people like spice. But I've had people come up to me say, "Oh yeah, like I like what are you selling? I need this because hey, let me show you a picture. I lost 50 pounds in the last year, on capsaicin. And I'm like, what? Like you just hear the craziest things. So a lot of people kind of know a lot of these benefits. They're really fascinating. I mean, it's like one of the few, FDA approved creams is pure capsaicin to put on
Y-
like your
for
skin.
shingles,
Yeah, yeah, for shingles and
it's a
pain.
shingles pad with capsaicin in the fabric.
It's
I
crazy.
think it's
Yeah,
Cutenza, I think is the name or
yeah,
something. But
yeah.
yeah,
Capsaicin, pure capsaicin. I mean, pure
yeah,
capsaicin. I mean, it's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
it's ins it's insane stuff. And obviously, I'm in it every day. I do wear a hazmat suit because it does like it does hurt and burn, but
Yeah,
uh,
you're like the Madame Curie of spice.
or Breaking Bad.
Right.
I feel more like Breaking Bad. But so
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
so that's
Madame Curie meets Breaking Bad. You got the radiation, and then you got the you got the tarp over your house.
well, fortunately, fortunately, I don't do too much of this stuff. And if I'm doing it at my house, I'm only doing the dehydrating and.
Right.
But yeah, but like that's so. I would say that probably the other thing just to point out that's like very different than just the logistics of building a business or discovering a business or making mistakes and failing and all that stuff that you and I talk about all the time in entrepreneurship. I think there's another one that has probably been the most eye-opening and shocking and different than I had never come to expect, which is culturally. Um, I mean, you think about it, and there's what, I don't know how many billion people there was. 5 billion people on Earth, 6 billion. I don't even
No,
know what.
now
Eight,
it's eight.
eight. Okay,
We're
thank you.
nearing 8.5
Okay,
now.
you can correct. There's
Yeah.
8 million people, 8 billion people on Earth. Like, correct that for me in the podcast. There's 8 billion people on Earth, and if you think about it, probably about more than 30% of those people in some way, shape, or form consume spice on a regular basis. This type of spice, like chili pepper of some kind of heat, and that's a huge, huge market, right? But what's really interesting is it knows no, it's got knows no gender, it knows no religion, it knows no party lines, and that's been a really interesting thing because the more, or even age. I mean, I have 8-year-old kids and 80-year-old grandmas that both want to consume it. I have people that are obsessed with it, everything in between. I have people that I would have probably never spoken to in my life with such different views on the world that when it comes to spice, it brings us all together. It's this it's this kind of unifying like language. It's this thing that like everybody that is in it can relate to it. It's not a what's the word? It's not a class thing. Like, wine has a little bit of a class divide in it, built into it. And I think
Yeah,
the coffee has some
there's no elitism.
there's no
There's no
elitism.
elitism
Coffee
to
has some
Spain. Yeah.
snobbishness to it. It's like, but spice is this really interesting, fundamental, super powerful, but very um, accessible, like molecule that somehow like connects the world. There's not a single person that you talk to that does not have an opinion about spice. Like they could say, I hate it. They could say, I love it. They could say, I like it sometimes, but nobody would be like, like nobody has no opinion. It's a very emotionally charged thing as well, which as you and I know, going back to your kind of theme of like differentiation, one thing that gives me great pleasure is having accidentally picked a business that whose very nature is emotional. Not because I said it's emotional, not because I'm trying to make you cry, not because it makes you sad, but if you taste something and you love it, you have an emotional experience. If you taste something and it's too hot, you have an emotional experience. If you like, spice creates an emotional reaction regardless of what somebody's mind is thinking. So it's not rational, it's very emotional. And by the nature of being very emotional, as we know, it sticks, right? It sticks because people will remember it. Again, for better or worse. I do have had people that call me and they go like, "Oh my god, I can never like eat this again. It was like way too spicy." Even though they have control, they still went overboard and they're like, "Oh my god, I went too far." But they'll never forget what they had, right? They'll never if somebody ever says to them, "Oh, I like spicy food." First thing they're going to say is, "Have you checked out this company?" And so built into the very nature of the thing, again, something I didn't plan for, is this really interesting byproduct that really is kind of the virality and the word of mouth, that it's just really hard to forget something that causes an emotional reaction like spice. And that is really cool.
Yeah, food is the great unifier to your point. I'm a borderline boomer, and I grew up when sushi was not on the
Right.
table,
I
right?
remember
Like
that.
raw
Yeah.
fish. Are you kidding me?
Yep.
And even certain Chinese foods and Mexican foods were kind of alien territory. And as our culture evolved and as ethnic diversity has expanded, so too has our exposure to different types of food. And with food comes understanding and commonality. And in a sense, spice is a ubiquitous layer on top of an already ubiquitous connecting point between diverse cultures. It's cross generational, as you mentioned, and it brings people happiness. It's something that's titillating. Do people need spice to survive? No, but having spice makes life so much better. Whether
Right.
you like a little bit or if you go over the top. I know you and I are like 11 people. So, but it's a connective tissue between all the 8 billion plus people on the planet. And to your great point, it's got heart to it. It's got heart and soul. It burns the blood in a way where you can't help but celebrate yourself, celebrate the family and friends that you're eating with, and celebrate the many cultures that tap into spice in so many different and diverse and exciting ways.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. So again, thanks for asking these questions. It's always fun to get to share and talk about it because obviously, as you know, as an entrepreneur, you spend 99% of your time in your own head and mostly working through logistics and problems. And, I think we've talked about this before, but like, this is my first, you know, solopreneurship kind of venture, and it's very different than I've always told people, like if you're going to start a company, do it with a co-founder because it's a lonely journey. And so I'm like, here I am, like obviously did not heed my own advice. And so it is a challenge. So it's opportunities like this to get to share it with you, to get to talk about it with the world and your listeners, and kind of talk about this thing that's actually more exciting now than it was when I first started. That's actually more invigorating now than when I first started, and more like it fuels me in a way I didn't think was possible. When again, it all started with just like, I wonder, what if I made this thing in this little box in this little container that can make it its way to my dinner table. What started there has now like opened my eyes to like a much bigger world. And again, regardless of the level of success, and I hope for it to continue to grow. But regardless of that, when you have an unexpected journey and that part of that unexpectedness is like really positive, you win. You kind of win no matter what, right?
Absolutely. So just to summarize, you're home with your dad. You're doing a lot of cooking. You're mixing and mashing things up in the kitchen. You realize that spice is kind of chaotic, and one thing leads to another. You have one problem, then a solution, then an even bigger problem that starts with this idea of playing around with spice. Let's see how I could translate this idea of gradations of intensity, make it into something that me and my family can use at the table to dispense spice at certain intensity levels. You learn that spice isn't just intensity, but it's flavor. You do research in terms of the mechanics of administering that spice with different types of grinders that you seek to be as affordable as possible, to make it as available as possible. You realize that if you scale, then you have a better opportunity to really get this thing going, and one thing leads to another. Then you discover the vagaries and wonder of flavor, that it's not just intensity, but it's the different flavors of spice. You figure it out. You create a company that can control not only intensity, but distribute flavor in a way that's compelling, 1 to 10. And all of a sudden, you're off to the races and you're making an impact. You're reaching out to experts in the field. You're reaching out to culinary folks who are coming to understand and appreciate that, wow, what can we do when we control spice? You've got appreciative moms whose kids have been helped by getting some spice. And here you are, poised with a company that you launched. What was it, 8 months ago that
Yeah,
you've
June.
launched?
Yeah, 8 months.
And tell us a little bit about the marketing aspect. And I would love for you to start with the box, because that's how you started. You know, your wife with Etsy, she's doing the packaging. You've got machines that can help you maybe cut it and make it. The thing that's most striking to me when I got your sample was the color of the box. And what was striking to me was it's different. You can't quite put your finger on what exact color this is. It's a little bit of red, and it's a little bit of brown, and it's a little bit of fuchsia. It captures, in terms of a brand identity through color, at least to me, was it had a boutiquey specialness to it, almost eccentric, and at the same time it captured this notion of heat and intensity, but with nuance. It's kind of a nuanced reddish fuchsia color that to me really nails what the company's about and the benefit that it provides you sitting there at the table. And it's pretty. To your point, you always wanted to create an experience that was functional but also beautiful in form.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, I really wanted it to be something like nobody had ever seen because, again, here I am sounding like I'm talking about something that doesn't exist. I mean, spice exists. Like you could go online, you can Google things, you can go into the grocery store, and whether you have a lot of choice or not, or whether you have a lot of control. I mean, the concept of chili pepper is nothing new, right? So if you're going to take chili pepper and try to bring it to the world and you think you're doing something interesting, but the world never asked for that, you have to have them pay attention in some way and you have to have it break through. And so, for me, it was really about yeah, I knew I wanted it to feel premium. I knew I wanted it to feel luxury. That doesn't mean necessarily expensive, but I wanted it to feel like something very like that somebody had put some thought into this because a lot of the stuff probably the best place to look if you want to just a comparator is in terms of hot and the spicy is like if most spice today is delivered via hot sauces and the hot sauce category or chips, chips is the other one that's appealing to a younger audience, but hot sauce category is literally the like it's you know, pucker butt company. It's like flames coming out of people's butt. It's skull and crossbones. It's like biker gangs. It's holy hell death. Like the entire category is practically like the same. Like it literally looks like Mardi Gras in hell. Um, and
100%. It's goth. It's
it's
black metal. It's
yeah, it's
liquid death.
yes,
It's
it's very
yeah,
much.
absolutely.
And
From a
so
branding point of view,
yes,
it's the exact diametric
right.
opposite of what you've launched.
Right, exactly. And so so when you're like looking at that, you're part of it is like that's what people recognize. So, you definitely have to be this is a big risk because nobody's going to look at it and intuitively say, "Oh, that's hot," or "That's spice," or "That's, all of that." So, you kind of have to be comfortable with, "Okay, I'm not going to go that direction." Um, so I wanted to go luxury, and I didn't want to go with the classic red, like fire flame red. And don't get me wrong, it's not that I didn't look at it. I looked at it, and I looked at lots of designs and thinking about it in colors. But ultimately, it was like I really like the subtlety. I call it Ferrari red. Maybe it's the Italian in me, but it's like there's just something about the color. I think you're right. It's like some people have even called it a little bit like salmon or pinkish. Has some salmon hues or pinkish. I wanted it to be something that, yeah, you knew that there was sort of a heat association to it, but that wasn't really what was supposed to scream. Very little words, which was very counter to, again, the category is everything all at once. Was everything that's inside, everything we put on it, like all the ways it's going to kill you, all the like. I was like, I literally asked myself the question, what is the bare minimum I can put on the packaging and still call it packaging, right? Like, what's the least amount that I have to say, that I can say that would still make somebody, because it's not just about like, the regs. It's also about, well, if somebody sees it and they pick it up or they ever see it in a retail setting, like if they don't even know what it is, which is probably the first big, like probably the best decision I ever made. I was like 3 months away from launching, and the company had a different name. It was called Matchbook. Um, and the short story there was like I really liked the idea of like the story of spice, of like really rewriting the stories of the book part and the match being the fire, but doing it in a really subtle. Had very similar packaging, but the name was different. And everybody thought it was like a dating site. Everybody thought it was like that I was launching something with dating. It's about like, and I was like very obstinate. I was like, well, yeah, like, well, I'm not gonna, like, people just don't get it. Once they're educated, they'll understand it. But then it occurred to me, I'm like, hold on. If I'm going to change everything about the category, maybe the one thing I should be clear about was what's in it. Like, what is it, right? Like, let's not make this super hard to understand the category. Like, yes, make it look completely different, but if I also call it something completely different, now I'm going to have a challenge, which is nobody's going to know what the heck it is. So that was like my trade-off was, yes, go completely different on the packaging, but then switch the name to SpiceQuest. This, which, I love the name, I don't get me wrong, but it's like it was a little bit more on the nose, because ultimately, even when I was doing Matchbook, everybody was like, "Oh, you know what? A great URL should be like Matchbook Spices." And I was like, everybody wanted to add the word spice or chili, and I was like, "Oh, is it because you don't understand what it is?" Yeah, of course. I'm like, "Well, why am I doing this to myself?" The so the packaging was really, really important. I had to balance it with still communicating what the heck it was, and that's kind of like how those two things kind of came together. And then there's another thing which is really interesting is the consumer experience. I mean, the kind of people, like, remember, I never told you this, but I said market. I remember saying farmers markets. That was like my target for launch, and then of course I realized I had to order a lot more spices. So I'm like, oh shit, now I have to sell more. So when do I sell? How do I sell? How do I market, like, to a broader audience? And then I can't. This is again how you cheat yourself into believing that something's like achievable. I was like, oh, okay, well, there's Father's Day, there's Christmas, I picked, like, in my mind, I picked like 2 or 3 times a year where people buy gifts for people. Usually, I don't want to say useless gifts, but like for the people that you've run out of buying gifts for, where you start buying like the ties and the watches and the clocks and you just start buying stuff that nobody really needs. Because I figured, and I know this sounds like I'm self-deprecating, but it kind of was like I didn't feel like the world probably doesn't need a spice kit. So I was like, but they do need something new. So I can be a gift that people give. So I kind of like thinking about the gift experience then, I knew that it had to feel premium. So that was like the second thing in my mind about like, what am I going to do? Is like, I need to appeal to people that like are going to be proud of giving this to someone. So it can't, so if you, again, let's go back to hot sauces for a second. It just can't feel cheap, right? It can't feel like something that somebody didn't put any thought into. Like, so there was so many different ways to go, but I had to think about like, how is this going to be both premium from a standing out, clear from a communication, but also like premium from a gift giving perspective, because that may end up being my only audience. Like I kind of said to myself, like, maybe if worst comes to worst, people will give it as a gift and hopefully somebody uses it after that. And obviously the gift giving was real, but it probably only makes up about 10% of sales right now. And so, like, fortunately, but people do come back and buy it for gifts for other family members all the time. And the reason they do is because you're not embarrassed to give it, right? It's not something cheap. It doesn't feel cheap. It doesn't look cheap. And people write that all the time to me. They're like, I was really surprised. They're like, this is really, really, really nice. And I'm like, it took me a while to understand why the heck people would say that. But I guess when I think about my own buying experience online, and Spitz, maybe you agree with this, is I buy a lot of stuff thinking like that's cool, that's novel, that's new, that's interesting, and 90% of the time it sucks. It's cheap, it breaks, it doesn't work. I'm disappointed, and most of the time, what do? You just move on. You're not like, oh, you don't file complaints, you don't return. Most people don't return the stuff. I mean, you might write a bad review, but most people don't because you kind of like it's buyer beware. And I, I was like, when people started going like I was really shocked that this is high quality. I was really surprised that these things are really nice, that they're really made of, that the packaging is really, and I was like, why would people be so surprised that something is good?
Well,
Right?
they're used to ass burner hot sauce,
Yes, true,
right? So
right.
to your point, the brand association with hot sauces in general as a
As a
category
category.
is the opposite. So in this
Yeah.
sense, you're kind of the Steve Jobs of hot stuff because he felt the same way, which is you're combining in one experiential product, in a sense, hardware and software, right? You have the software, if you will, by this analogy, is the peppers that you're
Yes. Yeah.
grinding, and the hardware is the grinder itself. And you're packaging this in a way which is a high-end premium product. So everyone senses that a lot of time and attention went into this, and it creates a flattering reflection onto the consumer. And Jobs early on felt the pressure point. You had Michael Dell pumping out computers for peanuts, and Jobs stuck to his guns. At one point, he was fired from Apple. Then he was brought back, and he revolutionized the company with this identical point of view that if you are creating something of value, then people will appreciate that value. That it's a holistic experience, it's not about the individual components. And people want to feel great associated with an iconic, simple brand. Think different. You don't need a million words and you don't need to oversell something because the thing should sell itself based upon the experience that you're conveying in a manner that's different, that's memorable, and that's ultimately transformative. And when you look at the packaging for SpiceQuest, it's all of these things. It has the minimalism of messaging. There's really only a couple words on the box, which is the epitome of the brand identity. It has this very distinctive color, which puts it into a class by itself. And it has the utility where you open it up and there are the vials or the grinders and there are the numbers. And you just want to reach for one and go for it and start playing with it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you saying that. Obviously, I think that's maybe too tall of a comparator, but I think that perhaps the
Well,
close.
it's this, yeah, it's a superlative, I
Yeah.
guess, where this isn't, a computer company
Yeah.
that changes the world, but
Yeah.
you're changing a category. And,
Yeah.
for the sake of this podcast too, is how
Right.
how do we brand? How do we differentiate? How do we start a company that makes an impact? And check, check, check. And it's Jobsian in the sense that you're honoring these fundamental rules of marketing, but you're bringing it to life in a way that's distinctive, original, and very, very creative.
Yeah, and I think maybe the best comparison, I mean, the most, being a student of jobs myself, but might be in the that along the way, we never knew what was really in Jobs' head, but along the way, there's a lot of decisions that one makes in dealing with a brand like this, or when you differentiate, I guess, to your broader audience. And I think those decisions you make is you don't know whether you're making a smart decision from a business perspective, from a unit economics, from a cost of goods, whether you're making whether you're being wise, foolish, stubborn, visionary. You don't really know. And I think at some point you have to make some decisions and you have to just be aware of the trade-offs, right? So there've been many times where I think asked myself, have I gone too far? Have I just obsessed too much about this one detail? Is this like the point at which the diminishing returns on the effort? And there's been other times where I kind of just had to stop and just be like, I think this is as good as I mean, this is as good as it's getting out right now. I have to ship, so to speak. And I think it's a really, I think it's a really tough one. And the reason I say that or draw that analogy is because I have obsessed a lot about packaging and the experience. And I do like make a lot of decisions that I think are, um, they take a little bit more time, that are a little bit more costly sometimes because I think that they're worth it, but I don't really have a validation. Like you don't, it's not like I'm constantly doing surveys and I have real time feedback where somebody's like, "Oh, that little detail that you added over here, that was really," you don't really know, so you kind of have to kind of just trust your instinct. And again, I say trust your instinct. That's not really the right words because I could be wrong, I could be right. I think you have to go with what makes you happy, because you, at the end of the day, you have to live with what you've built. And so to know when to stop something and to know when to continue, I think the only true barometer we have is, how is it going to make you feel? How's the choice that you make going to make you feel later, about what you've done, right? So if you cut a corner, if it's purely pragmatic and you think it's smart, just, you can't look back and then regret it. You just have to be like, hey, this was the decision I made. And I think a lot of times that's like a struggle when you're, I think it's a struggle when you're building any company. I think it's a struggle when you're building a differentiated brand, because to differentiate by its very nature, otherwise everybody would do it, to differentiate actually does require more thought and more work in certain areas that normally other people wouldn't do it. And the question really is how do you know when enough is enough? How do you know that you've gone far enough? And how do you know when to stop going in some direction? It's a tough one. I don't have an answer for that, but it's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, sometimes the answer just might be exhaustion, right?
Yes.
And also a deadline.
Yes.
They asked the writer James Joyce when he knew that Ulysses was finally done, and he said, I can't do this anymore."
Yeah.
So there you have it. When is a book ever done? When is
Yes.
a product ever complete? And this goes back to the idea, which is twofold. One, to your exact point, you can't be an innovator if you're obsessed by what other people think, because if you're obsessed by what other people think, then you're going to do things that other people will immediately accept and embrace, and the things that they accept and embrace are the things that they're familiar with it. So de facto, it's not innovation. You're just doing what everyone else is doing to get the most reach, to make the most impact, and ostensibly to make the most money. But that doesn't mean you're going to do anything new, and it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily go beyond par, because you're just entering the race
Yeah.
usually behind everyone else.
Yeah.
And then conversely, when you're innovating, it's really about having the courage to trust your own taste, make your own decisions, and your product, your service, your company gets infused with that brand identity, which is organic and genuine. People can feel what you put into something. This is the point you made earlier about doing the best you can, making sure every little detail and nuance is labored over and understood, and taking personal pride in what you're releasing to the world, because it becomes a reflection of yourself. And then that in turn becomes a flattering reflection on the consumer. People can feel this stuff. And I think that's the road to success. Whether or not you sell
Yeah.
10 million units or 10, just knowing that you've started something that you take pride in is already a win.
Yeah. No, I like that. I think that's, you have to be, I think you have to be proud of what you're doing, and you have to be, feel like it really is an internal compass that you kind of have to stay true to. And um I kind of leave you with maybe this story is like, I was sitting there with my son who's 8 years old, 9 years, was 8 years old, was 9 year old now, but sitting there, and he was like watching me for like, this was like month 14. And my kids took them a while to understand. They're like, Dad, why aren't you done? And they would just ask me that almost every day, because they like, the first day was, like first couple weeks was exciting, and then they saw me make a couple boxes. They're like, okay, great, so you're launching it. I'm like, and then they'd see me tear it all apart and start all over again. And I did that for months and months and months. And I remember he was sitting there like watching me do something, and I was like, I was and he's like, "What are you doing?" And I'm like, "Well, I have this problem here. I'm trying to fix this problem, and I don't like the way this came out." And he was like, "Well," he's like, "Well, why? Like, why do you want to fix that?" And I go, "Because I don't. It's not the way I want it to be. It's not kind of what I intended." And he goes, "Well, but nobody's going to notice." And I said, "But I do." I said, "But I notice. I know that it's not what I wanted it to be." And then I paused there, and I looked at him and I was like, "Well, Luca," I go, "Listen," I go, "there's a lot of times in life." This was like my moment, right? So I'd put my dad hat on and I was like, "Luca, there's going to be a lot of times in life where you're going to have choices to make, big and small, that nobody's going to know. Nobody's going to know. Nobody's going to notice. Nobody's going to know what you did, and they're kind of like they're between you and yourself. Um, but that's the difference between your character as you grow older and the kinds of things you're going to do and how successful you're going to be is going to come from the fact that when those moments come, you always make the best decision, not based on whether somebody's going to find out or not, but based on sort of your own personal integrity, based on how it makes you feel, based on knowing that you did the best you could. And you have to stick to that because that's the only true barometer that you're going to have in life to guide you, your only compass to guide you, because it's not about what you do when everybody's watching. It's about what you do when nobody will know. And I said, so for me, I know this can be better. I know I can make it better. So I'm going to do that. And that's going to matter to me. And maybe it'll matter to someone. I'll maybe never know. I said, but so it's really important for you to think about that as you get older. The choices you make is it doesn't matter what somebody else sees or knows. What matters is that you do know. And how's it going to make you feel about yourself? And I think that matters.
Amen to that. And that's a great way to cap it. Although I would like a quickie addendum.
Yeah.
And that has to do with some of the marketing that I've seen you doing. Now, just to give a little bit
Yeah.
more background, you've got your grinders from 1 to
Yes.
10, and then each grinder is associated with a particular flavor, which
Mm-hmm.
is a particular pepper.
Yep.
So you have the Reaper at the top end of the scale, right? And then the various pepper types are
Yep.
associated with a number. This is like the core. This is kind of like your core kit.
Yep.
And I've noticed you have been going around the country and exploring different flavors of peppers,
Yeah.
peppers
Yep.
that have wonderful names. I'm a writer, and
Yeah.
just some of the names of these peppers that you are incorporating into specialty kits.
Yep.
I love this. This is kind of line extensions that work. And then to the point that you made earlier about giving gifts, peppers associated with locations. Like, I saw that I think you went into the South, and then there's a pepper you found there. And peppers are associated with culture,
Hmm.
with locations, with people. And these in turn can percolate up into events. Like you had the Valentine's Day
Yep.
pepper kit, and
Yep.
then you have the different pepper kits associated with times of the year and cultures and locations. So the extensibility of the core 1 through 10 pepper kit seems to be able to seamlessly scale from an awesome marketing point of view all over the place. And can you share a little bit about your thinking, some of what you've discovered, and how this translates into the future of the company and your marketing effort?
Yeah. Um, no, I'm glad you noticed that, and it's it's a lot of work again. Like, and I keep saying like, oh man, like it's a lot of work. But I think again, it didn't start that way. I think once I had the core kit, and just for your listeners, the core kit is the 1 through 10. That's the main kit. But then I have sort of the classic and the junior and the solo. These kind of they're all just derivative of the core kit. They're just different ways configurations. So if you may not want the 1 through 10. You may just want two, three. The 3 through 6 or whatever. Um, and that's just different ways to consume, and depending on how you like to use things. But then I knew that I wanted to kind of go into this international, especially after talking to Dr. Paul Bosland about like it's like like different countries have different spices. And so I thought it would be great to start exploring. I'm working on an African kit right now that's really been interesting, just because you get to discover spices from like Nigeria and Morocco, just these different places that you're like, well, like, why are these places have their own kind of spice culture? And And it's really fascinating to like taste it and learn about it and tell the story about it. So there's that. But why? I guess the why is because the more I learn and the more I discover, the more it just blows my mind just how expansive the landscape of pepper and spice are. So much bigger than this. Like I such a small little world. I guess maybe the way to think about it, if you want to extend on the Apple analogy, because people have said this to me. They're like, "Oh, Fabio, what you really created is really kind of a platform, right? Like the core kit's like your 1 through 10, but then you have these different configurations, and then you have these extensions, and like the platform idea." And I think that's kind of accurate. And I think the reality is that all these growers are kind of like the app makers, right? They're all like, think about like the iTunes store, and there's all these different people in these different countries and these different cultures, and they're basically just all these incredible and wonderful peppers that have no access to the market. And that's what I discovered over the last, the harvest season last year, was I started kind of getting into these Facebook groups and mostly just to like listen and learn and understand. And I started seeing like there's like thousands and thousands of pounds of chili peppers being sold on a daily basis from people just picking them from their garden, taking pictures, putting them in a box, and then just saying, anybody want to buy? And literally these things would move in minutes. And these growers, they're not necessarily doing it all full time. They're doing it like in between things and other jobs. They're just passionate about it. And they're shipping, hundreds of boxes out a week. And I'd see the pictures and I'd see this stuff, and peppers I'd never heard of, like you said, Tom's giant peach pepper, the Apocalypse Reaper, or the Frankenstein bubblegum. Like, just what the hell is this stuff, right? So I had to get my hands on it, and so I started ordering all this stuff and getting these fresh peppers, and they blew my mind. Not only are they just beautiful fruits that you just fall in love with, or at least you learn that you are obsessed, but I got these fruits and I started drying them and trying them with other different people. People were like, "Oh my God, like, where do I get that? How do I, like, this is incredible." And so it just, I was like, I started like asking these growers, I'm like, "What do you do?" And they're like, 90% of this stuff is either being sold at a farmer's market locally, to production places that are doing hot sauce, or occasionally to like a specialty grocery store, like locally. And I was like, so you go online, you go to like Amazon, or you go to like these, like anywhere, Etsy, you go to places, like none of these peppers can be bought like like across the country. Like there's no marketplace for the non-expert, right? For the people that are not part of these groups, or for the people that are not buying for grocery stores, let's like, or the farmers markets. And I was like, that's incredible. You see these hundreds of different varietals that are being sold, by the thousands daily, are not actually accessible to the average consumer. So to me, the idea was born of like, well, I'd like to bring these to the world. Like, I'd like to share these with the world. I think that the world deserves to get. So I started like ordering and dehydrating, cutting, cleaning, dehydrating. I had to buy a freezer and 4 dehydrators. And like, again, this was not an operation I wanted to do, but I had to do it because this is the only way to do it. And before you knew it, I had probably several hundred pounds of peppers of like maybe 70, 80 different varietals. I should send you some pictures of my my pepper warehouse here. And they're all like just so different. So I get them all lab tested. I do taste testings with them. And then I just had the idea of like, hey, releasing these to people as limited editions and just letting them discover these even more unique, like not just international, but even again local peppers that nobody's ever had, that nobody can even access. And by the way, most of these, they're like in these what's called unstable conditions, meaning usually it takes about like 5 or 6 seasons before the pepper, kind of stabilizes. People are crossbreeding stuff all the time. And, these usually don't make it past the third or fourth season. So a lot of the peppers I have may never exist again. So they're like genuine. So I number them all, right? Because I'm like 1 through 25. This might be it for the rest. They're like literally ridiculously rare, may never exist again, but they're being made accessible now to, people on SpiceQuest, which doesn't exist at all, by the way. This idea of like this long tail of peppers being accessible, like off season, by the way. right? Because it's a mine's in a chili pepper format, in a dried format. Um, and people started really like I put out I would drop a new pepper and I would sell out probably 50% of my inventory in less than 12 hours. And you don't need like huge volumes to just get a lot of joy to know that you can bring these really rare peppers to market and sell something that nobody's ever sold before and know that people are like enjoying the living shit out of them. And so, okay, answering your marketing question, like part of it is just it's exciting as hell and I don't want my to be limited by just because it's complicated, just because it's hard, just because it's a lot of freaking SKUs and inventory to manage that I shouldn't do it. I ask myself, how can I do this? Right? Like, how do I do this in a way that is sensible and sustainable? How do I not let my excitement um, be squelched because I don't think it's practical? So finding the right balance between like extending into these other markets um, and exploring these possibilities is I don't know. That's the journey, right? I kind of wanted to go on this journey, and so to your point though is like for example, like I'm working on a pepper right now that's made with grasshoppers. So, um, and I tell people that, and they're like, "What?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, think about it. Like Oaxacan kind of like traditions. There's a lot of countries that they eat like crickets and grasshoppers, like dried and salted as kind of a snack. Well, I'm creating something, and I'm actually talking to a mezcal company, a tequila company about kind of doing some co-packaging, some co-promotion with them, and they're super excited. And they're like, "What?" They're like, "Who the hell would buy a pepper with with grasshopper And I'm like, "Well, I don't know. Maybe nobody, right? There's very possibly nobody, but." uh, you know, it's interesting to me. It's like I want to explore it. I think there is a culture out there that's open to experimenting with new exotic things. I think my brother's an entomologist, so it's kind of paying tribute to him a little bit too. And people do eat grasshoppers, so why not make them a little spicy, right?
Yeah, it's the future of humanity is probably insects. A great source of protein. High
Right.
ROI on that. And I'm glad that we didn't end the podcast before you went off on this line extension of your line extension, because I think this is the scalable opportunity. You're a lot like a wine vintner, where all the local vineyards with all the nuanced burgundies and chardonnays or whatever they have an opportunity to come to market. And you've not only tamed the pepper in terms of intensity and flavor, but now that you've established that platform, that foundational system that you were intimating, you have an opportunity to apply that expertise to explore new flavors that people just don't know about. So by bringing control to the pepper, it opens up this entire vista of new flavors and new opportunities. And as a marketing technique and as an opportunity for a startup, I think that's where everything seems to be logically headed, which is just expanding horizons. And most fundamentally, I think it's redefining the category. And I think that goes full circle. A lot of the obstacles and difficulties that you describe had to do with no one covering this before, which is like, wait a second, you're talking to the expert who's revealing that uneven ranges of Scoville units is just how it is. No one's been there before, and that's the ticket to ride for starting something in an area where people just haven't explored it before. And the benefit you provide is vast for all the reasons we've been describing, which is spice is ubiquitous. It's not like you've started some obscure company
Right.
focused on some nuanced aspect of toenail polishing or some exotic alloy, right? It's food, it's spice. Everyone knows it, everyone loves it. And I go back to the beginning of the conversation, which is I'm just astonished that you're the first one up to the plate, because it just seems to be such an unmet need.
Yeah, I'm pretty surprised too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's not that there aren't companies selling spice. I think that there's, there are companies obviously selling spice, but just doing it in a very different way and with a different mindset. I think a lot of people are just focused on the chili pepper, and I think that that is important. But I think what the rate limiting step there is that the association with chili pepper is there's so much baggage just when you think of chili pepper. And so if a company is really focused on positioning just the selling of, chili pepper, like, and that's kind of like their thing, that you're still gonna like you're gonna get the people that want chili pepper are gonna buy it. They're always gonna try it. But they're still staying within a very tight um like choice. So like it's always the same 5 to 7 peppers, which is where I could have stopped. I mean, technically after my first 10, I could have said that's it and not started this exploration. And I think that that's again differentiates me is because I decided to go further, even if it is harder to source, harder to market, and all that. But then the other part too is that the delivery, as you stated at the beginning, I have found that the delivery mechanism was the silver bullet, if there is such a thing as a silver bullet. Maybe not the silver bullet. Maybe was the unique value proposition, like that, which is, I mean, it's its own kind of interesting case study because you and I have worked in healthcare where, say, the delivery device for like insulin, can change the game, like how a medication is delivered or if something's on your skin or a patch. And, we've thought about it, we understand it intuitively and stuff, but when you bring it to something like spice and it's like grinders exist and spice exists, but you put the two things together and then you package it in a way and you market it in a way and people think and feel that it's something completely different. um, that's pretty cool. I mean, the delivery mechanism, that control that happens, and again, it could have been done cheaply too. So I think I would have probably not gotten very far beyond the gimmick if I had just stopped at like, oh, I'm just going to make it different, but it's going to break on you, or it's going to suck, or you can't refill it, or it's going to be, I could have probably made some mistakes there, but I decided to go more high end and premium. But I think the delivery device was really the key because I think maybe it's just the way it fits in somebody's hand because I've watched people's face when they look at the kit and they're like, "That's cool," and then they pick it up and they're like, they hold the grinder in their hand and they're like, "Oh, that's cool." Like there's something that changes in their whole demeanor and their whole approach when they feel this idea of like, because you really can, I can't describe it, but it's like until you hold it, but it's like you really feel like you have the control that I want to communicate you have. You feel it the moment you have it in your hand, even before you've dispersed it. And that's kind of magical. And again, unintentional. I wish I could say I was like had this wisdom of saying like, hey, like, this is the way we're gonna like master the market or whatever. It just so happens to be that people feel this incredible amount of control when they get to grip something like that, in that way. And it works. I mean, bottom line is, by the way, it obviously has to work. The whole thing has to work, and it fortunately it works, right? Like the heat levels are graded 1 through 10. That one works. The grinders do work. They do deliver the control, and the kit does hold together. Like all of that has to work. We've kind of talked about a lot of really interesting, cool entrepreneurial things, but like the table stakes here is the shit's got to work. Like, does it actually do what I say it does? And now, like that's really, really critical not to skip past the fact that it has to do what it does, and it does. And then everything else is what, like you said, differentiates and extends and captures the imagination. But if I didn't do the basics, I think that I wouldn't be here.
Yeah, what's your value proposition that you can control in an unprecedented way the intensity and flavor of spice? What's the reasons to believe that you're able to do that? Everything that you've just described in terms of the engineering, the mechanics, the quality of the delivery system, the quality of the pepper sorting and preparation, the quality of the packaging and distribution. What's the opposite of a commodity? Peppers, chili peppers are commoditized because they're just delivered in bulk and you don't know what you're getting. The opposite of that is a specialty product that takes care of all the details and is able to substantiate a unique value proposition with proven execution. And that is the definition of the integrity that you talked about, which is you take personal pride in doing it the right way. And you educated Luca, your son, and you're reminding all of us that that's what constitutes a successful brand and a successful company, that sense of courage, innovation, but also integrity.
Yeah. No, you're better than AI, man. You're like you summarize that.
not
You
not for long.
you summarize that
Not for
generative
long.
spits.
Yeah,
You
yeah, yeah.
you summarized that perfectly. Yeah, I couldn't have said it better. And and again, I really do appreciate. Like, I don't know if anybody's gonna ever listen to me talk for 2 hours, but I do appreciate you asking the questions and wanting to understand and wanting to share, because I think it is these are important things. I don't think a lot of people, I have a hard time getting to reflect on it much, and I don't think a lot of people have an easy way to like self-reflect about what they're going through. Um, and I do think that the things you're capturing, and at least whether I'm doing it perfectly or not, or whether I'm successful in the long run or not, that's not really the point. I think, but at least for your listeners, I think the real point is, I think there's some truths, foundational truths at work here that I think apply to like a lot of businesses. And I think you're right when you say about, I love your theme and what you're pushing here about differentiation and uniqueness. I do agree with you, which is, and it is ironic, of course, too. Like, here I come from a technology background, and like in the world of AI, I've decided to go into like the most rudimentary thing ever, like spices and grinders and things in your hand, which actually makes it really delightful, because it's really hard for AI to replace that, right? It's really like, but I think in a world where everything can be, anybody can do just about anything, I think doing the hard things that are very human, that are hard to automate, it's almost like, ask yourself a question: if AI can do this easily, maybe it's not a good business idea. I mean, like these things are hard, but the the ability to differentiate, like people ask me all the time, and I'm going to go on the record saying this. People are like, but like someone could copy you like tomorrow. Like what's stopping somebody from copying you? And my answer is, I'd like to see them try. And it's not because it's impossible to do all the things that I've done. Quite the opposite. It's because I don't, because it would take an extraordinary act of courage to do so. And like, because it just, you'd have to be, if you're a startup, you'd be, like, I'd be looking at it going like, you'd have to be a fool. Um, because, if now that I know everything I know, you'd be a fool to like try to take this on. Because I haven't even gotten into like the complexity of trying to fill grinders, thousands and thousands of grinders with spice, and building machines to do that, like, or any of the mechanics of that. Like, that stuff is really, really, really hard. I don't, people, there's a reason why people haven't done it too, which is this isn't, it's much easier just to take a bunch of spice, put it in a plastic bag, and ship it. And for the individuals, it's just as easy to go to this farmer's market or to take a picture on Facebook and sell it. Like, why would somebody try to solve this problem? Like, it's not something that I think a lot of people would want to tackle, because it's riddled with challenges. It's a hard problem. It's much harder than people think. It's like harder than I thought. So I'm not. I welcome competition. I just don't know if there's that many fools out there that would take me up on that.
Yeah, starting a company and going on your very human real world adventure that you've been on and that you're succeeding at is not equivalent to training a large language model. So we could lean on AI. Every other word from every other expert and consumer is AI, AI, AI. I find it exhausting, and it's refreshing to be reminded that the machines are basically just aggregating the hard work, the real world experiences, and the problem solving and creativity that you've described here, which is real people doing real things to benefit other real people. And
Yeah.
let's keep it that way.
Yeah. I mean, sure. One day they'll probably have robots that will do all these different things, but then they wouldn't be flawed. You know, they wouldn't make all the mistakes, and the mistakes is kind of what leads to the breakthroughs. And
Absolutely. From
so
Velcro to microwave ovens, it's the oops in the laboratory that brings about paradigm shift. And it's not Mr. Spock on the bridge making funny faces. So I think the Ghost in the Machine is doing quite well. And the Ghost Pepper now has a new outlet it never had before, and we're all thankful for it. So thank you for joining us. And thanks for listening to the Bald Ambition podcast. We've had our guest, Fabio Gratton, who is the Chief Spiceologist of SpiceQuest. We'll have links in the description. The conversation to be continued as Fabio's company evolves, as more and more people find out that they can control both the intensity and flavor of spice. And the world is a better place for more and better controlled spice. So thanks for joining us.
thank you so much for doing this, Fitz. Thank you.
Right on.
Thank you.